technology is not something I'm comfortable with.
I'm president of the foundation of the hospital and vice president of the engagement. Ann White, who coordinates these and puts everything together, has graciously allowed me to introduce our speakers tonight. Maybe it's because we ate lunch together, I'm not sure. Maybe because we have a good relationship the last 3 years I've been here, but I consider Dr. Bowman one of my good friends, so it's an honor to introduce him. I wish I could repeat his title at the college exactly, but I know it's professor. There's an honorary name associated with it.
It's the Tippy family. We call it the Tippy chair.
The Tippy chair. Right in line with the pentatonics you were talking about earlier.
An unstable position.
Beyond the Tippy chair, Dr. Bowman is also a world-renowned authority on Shakespeare. So we are very honored to have him here tonight. He's currently on a sabbatical at the college, and I won't get into bragging about him too much, but he just finished writing a lengthy book that only took him about a decade, I think? 2 decades to write. So it's very exciting, and I'm congratulating him over lunch to finish it. So Dr. Bowman it's a privilege to have him here, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Don and Ann, for inviting me. I'm going to present material that's new for me today, so I hope you don't go to sleep. There are drums here, just, just in case. I am also not very adept with technology, so this may go flying at some point. I'm not. It doesn't swing quite. I like it. Maybe I should just stand there. So, does this? Oh, you're capturing this on film. I better put it. And this thing easily becomes unplugged. So my goal tonight is to talk with you for about half an hour about Shakespeare in America, the history, the evolution of who Shakespeare is in America. Then to show you 2 film clips. One is from this 2010 production by the Royal Shakespeare Company. Another is from a 2001 American film to show you how Americans can reshape Shakespeare to their own purposes, cultural purposes. I'm hoping we'll have time for that. I'm hoping the machinery will allow us to do it. Each one of those clips is 7 minutes, and that would allow us a few minutes to talk about them afterwards. Right? And then we can all have drinks at 6:30. First, one generalization that may or may not surprise you. Shakespeare is the most popular dramatist in the world. His plays are performed and read more often than those of any other playwright in virtually every country of the world, not just the English-speaking world. The colonies you would expect, Canada, the United States, Australia, India, but places like China, Japan, countries in Africa. And one of the reasons for this is that when Shakespeare is done in non-Anglophone, that is foreign-speaking countries, they don't have the problem with his language. A director will almost unfailingly hire a contemporary playwright to do the translation. And so they are getting Shakespeare it may be elevated and poetic diction, but it's still modern language for them, so it's easy to understand. The paradox for us in the English-speaking world is that the glory of Shakespeare, which is his language, is still its biggest obstacle. And as we get further and further away from the late 16th century, his prose and his verse sound more and more remote to us. Now, a brief Shakespeare biography. Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564 and died when he was 52 in 1616. So his quadricentennial of his death is coming up in 1616, and that's in 2016, and that's going to make a lot of opportunity for people to celebrate around the world. A lot of people will celebrate his death. I think my students will. Shakespeare was the son of a glover in Stratford who was also an alderman. He was on the city council. He was a relatively prosperous man. And in part because of that, Shakespeare was ensured a good education at the local grammar school. Grammar school in England doesn't mean what it does in the United States. It meant a high school. It meant a school that you went to up to the age of 16. Shakespeare had a very good schoolmaster. He spent 16, well, not 16, if he started at 5, he would have had 11 years studying Latin primarily, and Greek, and English, and studying the classics, learning a lot of history, science such as it was. These were days before Galileo and Copernicus. But knowing a great deal about Greeks and Romans and philosophy, and certainly the Bible. He would have been familiar with the English Bible, which was a Protestant Bible, because there was the Protestant Reformation in England in the 1530s, and the Protestant church was firmly ensconced in England when he was in school in the 1560s. Even though there were a lot of recusant Catholics, it was illegal to be Catholic, but there still were a lot, and a lot of people think that his father may have been as well. So that's Shakespeare's biography. One issue that comes up a lot when I'm at cocktail parties and people find out I teach Shakespeare, and that is the question, did he really write those plays? What about the Earl of Oxford? What about Francis Bacon? What about Christopher Marlowe, the other great playwright who happened to die in 1593? It was only 20 years before Shakespeare's plays stopped being produced, but still, that doesn't disqualify him as a candidate. And what is the reason for this? We call it the anti-Stratfordian movement. It began in America with a kook named Delia Bacon, who, if she were alive today, would be into conspiracy theories. She decided that Shakespeare, from a farming community, Stratford-upon-Avon, could not have had the education, nor know about courtly things, kings and queens, know about all the protocols, to have written those plays. And therefore, it must have been someone like Sir Walter Raleigh, right? Who wrote them under the cloak of whatever he put on the ground for Elizabeth. It was picked up by Mark Twain, who also was an anti-Stratfordian. Eventually, it moved across the Atlantic. Sigmund Freud was an anti-Stratfordian. Ironically, if you're familiar with Mark Rylance, many of you know the actor Mark Rylance, who for a number of years was the head of the Globe Shakespeare Theatre in London, a wonderful actor who recently was on Broadway. He's also an anti-Stratfordian. He doesn't believe Shakespeare wrote the plays. But actually, he grew up in Canada, so that may help to explain it. Why? Why are people intent on believing that Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays? And why did it come up in the mid-19th century? Well, if you think about what was happening in America in the mid-19th century, there was the big movement to educate everybody in public schools. And because of that movement, if you wanted to have the kind of education that Shakespeare got in the grammar school, you had to go to university. Right? There was a kind of leveling out of education. After all, most people in, let's say, the 1850s, 1860s weren't getting past 4th grade or its equivalent. And so there was a real impulse to give more people education, and the more you gave them education, the less you could focus on Greek and Latin. That was the preserve still of universities in America, and so people thought anachronistically that must have been true in Elizabethan England. And so, of course, then Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays. It had to have been somebody with a Cambridge education like Christopher Marlowe, or wonderful tutoring at home, as Queen Elizabeth had, or an aristocrat, somebody who knew courtly ways and therefore could be conversant with the things that Shakespeare writes about in his plays. It's really an anachronistic notion. It's kind of an ironic notion for Americans to have this elitist view that in order to write Shakespeare's plays, you had to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge. You couldn't have done it with an ordinary Elizabethan education. But that's American democracy for you. We have no class system. There's nothing elitist about America. It's just that Americans like to think elitistly. So that's a segue into when did Shakespeare come to America. He actually came over with the Puritans, right? His plays were about 100 years old when the Puritans crossed over. And there's an irony in this, because the Puritans were very anti-theater. In fact, in England in the 1640s, the Puritans who were in power in the House of Commons closed the theaters for 20 years. They thought they were immoral, they would breed immoral behavior in audiences, and they were against Scripture. At the same time, the Puritans had copies of Shakespeare because they believed that his plays imparted good moral lessons. It's different if you read it, right? Shakespeare began to be performed in the United States in the 18th, well, not quite yet the United States, in the 18th century. British actors, British theater companies would come over and perform the most popular plays on rudimentary stages, but increasingly purpose-built theaters began to be built in the major cities like Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore. By the end of the 18th century, the educated classes in America knew a lot about Shakespeare. Editions began to crop up. Most of them were imported from Britain, and they would put a different cover on it and call it an American edition. And people who were educated, certainly people who had university educations, knew a lot about Shakespeare, but it had begun to seep into the mainstream as well. I'd like to read just a little bit about how pervasive Shakespeare was among the educated classes in America from a book written by a friend of mine who used to teach at Allegheny, actually. Among the students who presumably first encountered Shakespeare in college library was the future second president of the U.S., John Adams, graduated from Harvard in 1755, whose diaries abound with praise for, quote, that great master of every affection of the heart and every sentiment of the mind, as well as all the powers of expression. Adams's wife Abigail kept a pocket edition of the works on her nursery table, with the result that their son John Quincy, another future president, would later recall having been, quote, man and boy, a reader of Shakespeare. At 10 years of age, I was as familiarly acquainted with his lovers and his clowns as with Robinson Crusoe and the Bible. Thomas Jefferson may not have encountered Shakespeare's work at quite so young an age, but he was only 28 when he declared that, quote, a lively and lasting sense of filial duty is more effectually impressed upon the mind of a son or daughter by reading King Lear than by all the dry volumes of ethics and divinity that ever were written. You can see how Shakespeare was treated as a source of ethics, as a source of religion. He gradually, as we're going to see, displaced the Bible as a chief text for study in school. So that Shakespeare came to America as a moralist, which is interesting, and he was embraced by the literate classes, that was educated Americans. If you want to see how far it went, there's this. In 1786, during Thomas Jefferson and John Adams's diplomatic visit to England, on a side trip to Stratford-upon-Avon, these American founding fathers verged on bardolatry, that is, the worship of Shakespeare. Here's a little anecdote, actually. The worship of Shakespeare is still done in Stratford-upon-Avon. Hello. You know the connection snapped. Oh, here it is. How do I take care of this? I love technology. It must clip on. There we go. Okay. About 7 years ago, we were on sabbatical in Stratford, and if you've ever been to Stratford-upon-Avon, you'll know that it's a real tourist haven, and people go to worship Shakespeare. And my younger daughter was then in first form. She was 5 years old, and her school field trips, because it was right in the center of the village, the school was walking distance to all of the Shakespeare properties, as they're called. Her first school field trip was to Shakespeare's birthplace, where they got to touch Shakespeare's bed and all of this stuff. And then a couple of months later, this was in the second semester, a couple of months later, they went to Holy Trinity Church, where they were able to see the bust of Shakespeare, and they were let behind the sealed-off area to touch his grave. And the next week, the whole school, it was a Church of England school, was marched down to Holy Trinity Church for an Easter service. And at dinner that night, we said, Lily, what is Easter? Do you know? And she said, yes. It's the day Shakespeare rose from the dead. She learned her lesson well. But this is Stratford. Now, it's not far off this. Now, how am I going to do this? My glasses were. Yes. Can you see how I never change anything at home? I never do anything practical. Okay, I'm going to put these on first. Then this. This is going to take till 7 o'clock, by the way. There. This is about Jefferson and Adams going to Stratford. Jefferson, Adams claimed later, got on his knees to kiss the ground in Stratford, and at the rundown Shakespeare birthplace, they cut a souvenir piece from a wooden chair, Adams recorded, according to the custom. Although Adams was unimpressed by the bust of Shakespeare in Holy Trinity Church, he believed any sculpture or painting of Shakespeare must be inconsequential because, quote, his wit and fancy, meaning his imagination, his taste and judgment, his knowledge of nature, of life and character, are immortal. In the name of the Father and the Son. There we go. So that's where Shakespeare was in the late 18th century. Now, in the 19th century, Shakespeare became a Democrat. Not the political party, but somebody who espoused democratic values. The plays that were most widely read were seen to embody the values of this new democracy. How many of you have read Julius Caesar? A play about killing a tyrant, and you have these Brutus and Cassius. These in the play they're called conspirators, but were seen to represent American values in their killing of the corrupt monarch, right, George III. So Julius Caesar was a very extremely popular text, as was Macbeth, also about the killing of a king. And these plays began to be performed a lot and read a lot. Versions of the plays also began to be performed for the uneducated. Shakespeare became the most popular form of entertainment for every class, for every group in the United States during the first half of the 19th century. Often the plays were cut and reshaped, as they were sometimes in London as well, so that you would get tragedies that were about half their length, and they would be preceded by what's called a droll, a farce. A lot of the comedies had the inclusion of music and dance, the equivalent, I guess, of our modern musicals. But this is the way Shakespeare was presented to the public, and the public ate it up. So there was a whole spectrum of how Shakespeare was done, from what we would call serious theater, more serious productions of Shakespeare, to entertainments that were accessible to virtually anybody. In the great westward expansion, every pioneer, it was said, had a Bible and a copy of Shakespeare with him. And that's been demonstrated pretty well by evidence from the California Gold Rush. When a lot of people who were literate were quoting from Shakespeare, British acting companies would go to California to act in saloons and other venues like that, and Shakespeare was the most popular entertainment for people in that gold rush. When I was working on this sort of thing surprised me. I was amazed at how pervasive Shakespeare was in American culture. Yet Shakespeare continued to be read by the literate and the educated for moral edification, not just for entertainment. One of his champions was Abraham Lincoln. I'd like to read you a little bit about Abraham Lincoln, and imagine yourself in this situation. Lincoln was deeply influenced by Shakespeare, especially from his frequent reading of Macbeth and other tragedies. Interesting that he should be absorbed by a play about the murder of a king. He had admired and absorbed the play since early adulthood, both by reading, usually aloud, and by attending performances before and during his presidency. I always think it's odd that people would read Shakespeare aloud, but my students tell me that frequently they will meet in McKinley's, in the student union, and in groups, and read his plays aloud because they understand them better. Just so it's still going on. A French diplomat who 5 days before Lincoln's murder accompanied Lincoln from Richmond, Virginia to Washington, and that would have been quite a long trip, recalled, and he's quoting here, and I can't imagine this, Mr. Lincoln read to us for several hours passages taken from Shakespeare. Can you imagine being in a stagecoach or something and having somebody read Shakespeare to you for hours? Most of these were from Macbeth, and in particular the verses which followed Duncan's assassination, unquote. Among the lines Lincoln read and reread on that occasion were almost certainly Better to be with the dead, whom we, to gain our peace, have sent to peace, than on torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Although Lincoln is not known to have voiced the idea explicitly, he seems to have brooded over the play's implications that one should forfeit his life for having caused others to lose theirs. 2 days later, Lincoln had a prophetic nightmare about his own death. A recurring dream, Lincoln said, and this is quoting Lincoln, that has got possession of me, and like Banquo's ghost, Banquo is the ghost in Macbeth, it will not down. Nor would Shakespeare's lessons leave the fugitive Booth alone. John Wilkes Booth's journal in the days after the assassination, while he frantically fled his pursuers, repeatedly quoted both Julius Caesar and Macbeth as he attempted to justify his heinous deed. Now, just a couple of words about John Wilkes Booth, who, as you all know, was an actor. He was actually a member of the greatest acting family in the middle of the 19th century in America. His father had come from England, was one of those actors who came over to try to make his fortune here and then stayed. He had 3 sons, all of whom turned out to be actors, and by far the best one, Edwin Booth, became the most famous actor in the later 19th century in America, and he actually was forgiven very readily by the public for his brother's heinous crime, and continued acting Hamlet and Richard III and whatnot in the 1860s and into the 1870s. John Wilkes Booth, the year before the assassination, had acted Julius Caesar with his brothers. And clearly it was on his mind, perhaps even as he was plotting the assassination. So you can see how indelibly Shakespeare is imprinted on American culture in the 19th century. Let me tell you about something else that explains how there are rifts in American culture and the role that Shakespeare played. This is called the Astor Place riots. Astor Place is a place in New York City that was built by the wealthy, the so-called 400, and it had a magnificent new theater. And that theater was opulent enough and pricey enough to exclude the hoi polloi from New York, that the New York gentry did not want to attend the productions. The Astor Place riots were caused by the following. There was a visit by a very famous, the eminent British tragedian named William Macready, who was regarded as the best actor probably in the English-speaking world. But a rivalry had arisen between him and an American named Edwin Forrest, who was a kind of blood and thunder actor. He was passionate. Apparently he didn't speak verse particularly well, but he was loud and he was passionate, and apparently he was a magnificent physical specimen, and women in audiences used to faint when they saw him. Forrest had toured England and was not very well reviewed, and he began to suspect that Macready was behind the bad reviews he was getting. He was a rather paranoid figure. And so when Macready visited America, Forrest in a way stalked him. If Macready was going to Baltimore to act Richard III, Forrest would go to Baltimore at the same time and act Richard III often on the following night. Or they'd go to New Orleans and do the same thing. So they had established this rivalry, and each one had a fan base. And Macready's fan base was in the educated, wealthy elite of New York, and Forrest's fan base was in the working class. And he had very vocally espoused democratic values and championed what we would call the working class in New York, including recent Irish immigrants who were very much behind him. What happened is that Macready performed Macbeth one night at Astor Place, while Forrest performed the same role, Macbeth, at another more populist theater named the Broadway Theater. Forrest's fans bought tickets in the gallery, the highest balcony of Astor Place, and they interrupted Macready's performance of Macbeth in the third act by throwing fruit, eggs, and even chairs down onto the stage. Macready had to abandon the performance, and he wanted to leave New York and go back to England, but a letter signed by, I believe, 30 eminent New Yorkers, including Herman Melville, encouraged him to stay and not give in to this kind of tyranny of the mob. So 3 nights later, he performed Macbeth again. And this time, Forrest fans were not only in the theater to heckle, but outside the theater. 20,000 people gathered outside the Astor Place. Many of them having no idea of theater, but they were anti-British and they were anti the wealthy classes in New York. So it became very much a sort of cultural confrontation. And they started throwing rocks at the theater. The people inside the theater were interrupting the performance by throwing the same things they had done 3 nights earlier, and outside the theater, they were actually rioting. It's the first time that New York had to call in the militia. The crowd would not disband, and so they fired into the crowd. Estimates of those who were killed vary between 10 and 31, and 150 were injured. That over performances of Macbeth. What happened, though, is interesting and ironic. It was not to the benefit of Forrest or the democratic cause of Shakespeare in America. What happened after this, increasingly in the latter half of the 19th century, is that Shakespeare on stage became the province of the upper classes. And it came to be known as high culture. And the wealthy would go to see Shakespeare, and he would be done in so-called legitimate theaters, relatively new phrase. And low culture basically turned its back on Shakespeare. Now, it's not simple, and I don't have time to explain, but not only was low culture identified more with what came to be vaudeville and things like that, but this was also the time when there were huge immigrations from non-Anglophone Europe, from countries where people did not speak English. And so there was a great opportunity then for other kinds of entertainment to arise. But unfortunately, Shakespeare then became the preserve of high culture. And he still has that to a degree in America. So how did people get to know Shakespeare? How were they fed Shakespeare? Through school. I mentioned earlier that public school educations were on the rise in the second half of the 19th century. And it was believed that Shakespeare should be central to those educations. And here I'm going to read a little bit from an article that I recently wrote. Have you all heard of the McGuffey Reader? McGuffey readers were a staple of the curriculum beginning in the middle of the 19th century, but increasingly as the 19th century went on. Shakespeare became central to American education following the Civil War. Sections of his plays were reprinted in the McGuffey Reader, a collection of extracts from, as they said, the best American and English writers, which generations of children in upper school grades were made to study, recite, and even memorize in the interest of learning, quote, industriousness, honesty, and moral probity. Can you see how that carries over from the Puritan era? That why do you study Shakespeare in school? It's because he's morally enlightening. As early as 1848, a Shakespeare scholar, Norman Henry Hudson, declared that Shakespeare's plays provided, quote, a far better school of virtuous discipline than half the moral and religious books which are now put in the hands of our youth. And as literature gradually replaced the Bible as required reading, successive editions of McGuffey included more Shakespeare passages for, quote, the special purpose of influencing the heart by sound moral and religious instruction. I don't really get my religious instruction from Shakespeare. People now are debating whether or not he was a Catholic, whether he was a Protestant, etc. But by 1920, sales of the McGuffey Reader were estimated to have exceeded 122 million. Think about the population of America in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, and that many McGuffey Readers had been printed, thus ensuring that many American children had a common secondary school experience. And at the same time, while colleges in America were becoming more egalitarian and were dropping the requirements of Latin and Greek, who do you think replaced them as literature? English departments arose in the late 19th century in this country, and Shakespeare was the staple of those English departments. So all of this, to me, it has a very Protestant feel to it. It's all about Calvinist self-betterment, right? It's about being elect. It's about being worthy of God's grace by learning your religion and ethics by reading Shakespeare. So it's got real seriousness of purpose. One of the results of this is that in the 20th century, let's say ordinary people didn't go to Shakespeare. Shakespeare really was done in New York City and the major cities, but Shakespeare was not popular in the provinces. Let me see where I am in my notes here. There was, in a way, a ready audience for Shakespeare. I'm going to skip ahead for a while. How did Shakespeare re-enter the theatrical mainstream? Today, there are hundreds of summer Shakespeare festivals in America. Millions of people attend at least one Shakespeare play, usually in the summer. Texas alone has 20 summer theater festivals in major cities, but in small towns. Pittsburgh used to have a summer theater festival. It was a very good one until the faculty at Pitt started disagreeing with one another and decided to abandon the project. You get Shakespeare in the park in many, many small towns. You find Shakespeare being played on beaches, by lakes, in mountains. It's regarded as a form of cultural entertainment. It's a way of getting your culture and morality while being entertained at the same time. What an American agenda that is. I have one quotation here from, I love this one, from somebody who wrote about 30 years ago in the San Francisco Chronicle. He said, "Shakespeare has become the country's moral and cultural arbiter. His plays are disseminated with the conviction that they would enlighten average folk who were to swallow him not for their entertainment, but for their education." In the colloquial words of columnist Gerald Nachman, who was recalling how he'd been force-fed Shakespeare in school, Shakespeare becomes theatrical spinach. He's good for you. If you digest enough of his plays, you'll grow up big and strong intellectually, like Teacher. I think that's not why people go, but let's talk about how Shakespeare festivals evolved in the United States. This is where I'm going to conclude. In 1935, a man named Angus Bomer founded the first Shakespeare festival in the United States. It was in Oregon. He was a student of a British academic who taught at a number of places. He eventually became the chair of the theater department at the University of Texas. But in 1930, he was doing Shakespeare productions at the University of Washington, where Angus Bomer was a graduate student. Angus Bomer then got a job at Oregon Normal School. It was in the early Depression. He was lucky to get a job. And he decided that he should start a Shakespeare festival in the grounds, in the shell of the old Chautauqua Theater, which no longer had a dome on it. It was open air, in the town of Ashland, which had a tiny population of 2,000 or 3,000. He persisted. The Oregon Shakespeare Festival now is the largest theater company in America, and it has 400,000 patrons per year. The nearest cities to it are San Francisco, 400 and some miles away, and Portland, 300 miles away. It's in the middle of no place. But it has become a destination festival. And that spawned a lot of other festivals. There's one in Utah. There's one in Colorado. There's one in Alabama. There are a couple of similar ones in Texas. There's one in New Jersey. And what do they have in common? University affiliations. The most popular of these are supported by colleges. It would be as if Allegheny decided to have summer theater and do Shakespeare in the Shakespeare in the Diamond, done by the theater department at Allegheny. Many of these across the country are free, but what they have in common is that they have roots in education, and they present what, I love this term, is widely used now as edutainment. You get your cultural fix. You learn morality while you're being entertained. So how are we doing here? How do Americans make Shakespeare speak to contemporary audiences who are unfamiliar with his language, who are resistant, and who think of Shakespeare as theatrical spinach? I think we have time to do these clips, actually. They have to make the plays entertaining, but often they will Americanize them in rather extreme ways, and I have a film clip to show you. There's one way in which it's done. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the scene I've chosen. It's the second scene from Hamlet. How many of you have read Hamlet? How many of you who've read it remember it? Okay, let me just fill you in on the plot briefly. Hamlet is a young man who is a student at Wittenberg. It's ironic that he's a student at Wittenberg because that's the university that's associated with Martin Luther in the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Shakespeare giving us a signal there. Hamlet has come back to Denmark for his father's funeral. His father has died suddenly in the garden. He doesn't know then that his uncle has actually poisoned him because his uncle wants the crown himself. So Hamlet has come back and realizes when he comes back that his uncle has married his mother. Something that Elizabethans may have regarded as incest. Hamlet's not a happy boy. In Act 1, Scene 2, we see the new king, whose name is Claudius, attempting to take control of the situation. He's in a precarious situation. Norway is threatening Denmark. Don't you love it? One Scandinavian country threatening another with the A-bomb. Right? There's a young man named Fortinbras who is angry that his father had lost a war against old King Hamlet and basically wants revenge. He wants to attack Hamlet. So the new king, Claudius, has to deal with that. He also has to deal with the succession issue. Because an English audience, for whom Shakespeare was writing, would have assumed that if the old king died, who would accede to the throne? His son, young King Hamlet, but that's not what happened. His brother acceded to the throne. Conveniently, Hamlet was off at college. So he has to deal with that as well. He also has to appease Hamlet and others that he married the queen so quickly after his brother's death. Now, politically, it makes sense. You shore up your power by marrying the queen, right? It helps to preserve a kind of continuity, especially if your country is being threatened from someone from the outside. So Claudius has to deal with all those things, in addition, as you'll see, to allowing young Laertes, the son of his best advisor, Polonius, to go back to college, where he's at the Sorbonne, he's in Paris. He's dying to get back to Paris, wonder why. But he's going to be an obedient boy. But then eventually Claudius has to address Hamlet, who doesn't want to have anything to do with Claudius. He doesn't suspect yet that Claudius has been guilty of foul play. But so what is in this play for an American audience? It's all about kingship, it's about succession, it's about foreign incursions by Norway. Is there anything that would interest an American audience? And then you have the language. How the hell do you penetrate Shakespearean language? I'd like to show you a production that was done by the Royal Shakespeare Company, a scene from it, in 2010. This was directed by the person who is currently the head of the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's a filmed version of a stage play that was done in 2010. David Tennant, who is Doctor Who, plays Hamlet. Patrick Stewart, whom some of you may remember, plays Claudius in this. If this machine works, we will be watching this one scene. It takes about 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'm going to show formal production. And this is the kind of production you see at the Royal Shakespeare Company. What I'm going to show you now is the same scene done in an American film that came out in 2001. It's directed by a sort of fringy filmmaker named Almereda. It stars Ethan Hawke as Hamlet, Kyle MacLachlan, whom some of you may remember from Sex and the City, as Claudius. Claire Danes is Ophelia, who figures in this. Hamlet's girlfriend is given a prominent role in this, and Bill Murray as Polonius. Just a little bit about it. The director obviously has decided to make it an American story. But how does he do that? First, he sets it in New York City in the year 2000. He also makes Denmark the name of a corporation. And you have a Hamlet who is related to, if you saw slacker movies back in the 90s, he is dressed like a slacker. He clearly is sort of a misfit, somebody you can imagine not wanting to go to college at all. And as the film opens, he's sitting behind his computer screen. Now, keep in mind that this is 15 years ago, so the technology is going to seem a little bit primitive. But he is putting together images on that film that will eventually be the show that he performs for his mother and his uncle to try to trap his father, his uncle, into admitting his guilt for having murdered his father. But here you get a Hamlet who is constantly looking through cameras. His vision is constantly mediated. I think that's enough about this, but Let's see if I can get it for you. My students love this film. I think they identify with the sort of misfit, the person who is wedded to technology. The fact that Fortinbras is suddenly a corporate raider. This film is very much about corruption in corporate America. I don't know whether you noticed that Claudius has a hitman walking behind him. So there are a lot of allusions here to gangster films in America and whatnot. But this is a film, no matter what you think of the acting quality. I can't see Ethan Hawke again after this. Maybe he'll learn to speak verse someday. But it's a film that is very much conceived as an American story. And this is an extreme version of what directors will sometimes do with Shakespeare in American performance. But it is something that is helping to win a new young audience for Shakespeare in this country. And I'm happy to entertain any questions or thoughts you might have.
Jim, I've got a question. You mentioned the number of books that were, the Bible and Shakespeare traveled. It doesn't seem that either one of those books right now accompany most young kids anywhere.
Right.
So I guess the question amongst that I have for you as the Shakespeare expert is, what do you see in the future for that?
Hard to know. I mean, I think, I'm just speculating here. I think reading Shakespeare is going to become increasingly difficult for people. My own students, I think, are reading less. I think they're on their computers much more, or texting. And so the language may become less and less familiar to them, and just the complexity of the syntax is going to be something that they'll struggle with more because they are not reading books as much. On the other hand, there is a lot of evidence that Shakespeare performances in America are getting more and more popular. I mean, it really is astonishing how many theater companies there are. A couple of years ago in New York City, there were about 8 Shakespeare productions going simultaneously and getting big audiences. 4 of them were imports from London. But so you've got big audiences. Chicago has a huge Shakespeare company. When you have a theater company in Montgomery, Alabama, that is making millions every year on Shakespeare and on other things, it's hard to know, Roger. I think Shakespeare is going to continue to be popular in the theater and in films. My hunch is that students are reading fewer Shakespeare plays in high school. How many of you, when you were in high school, had to memorize Shakespearean passages? I know I did. I think it's pretty much past now that students don't do that anymore.
I think they memorize anything.
Yeah.
Even like, poetry or...
Right. And if teachers are not comfortable teaching Shakespeare, he's going to drop out of a high school curriculum. And so I don't know what that means. I mean, I know the Meadville Tribune fairly recently had the question of, with some horror, somebody was writing in that Shakespeare is no longer required of English majors in colleges. Well, Shakespeare hasn't been required in most colleges for a long, long time, but English majors take it. And in fact, a majority of my students in Shakespeare classes are not English majors, they're science majors, et cetera, and they need to take a humanities course and they'll pick Shakespeare. Why? Because he still has so much cultural cachet. So, there's still going to be a market, but the reading market may dwindle. There may be less and less. That's just my hunch. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Jim, you think it's possibly because of the teachers that are saying that they don't like teaching Shakespeare, like the one in Burbank High School in Sacramento, that recently said that Shakespeare's English was very difficult, so she did not feel that it was worth teaching her students.
Yes, and I think there's an impulse among younger teachers to want to do books that they consider more relevant. And certainly as, there's a push for greater diversity, et cetera, that's going to be reflected in a literature curriculum. And so, understandably, the figure who's perhaps most difficult for them to teach might be the one that's dropped.
Right. And I felt that she was the one that had the difficult time understanding it. Therefore, if you don't understand something, certainly do not.
I think that's right. But again, it depends on what colleges are requiring their education majors to do.
Yeah, this was high school.
Yeah, but I mean, what training she has had? Has she had a good Shakespeare class? I mean, I've had some students of mine in past years have written to me when they've had to teach Shakespeare and they haven't been in a Shakespeare class at Allegheny. And they are stuck. Once in a while they stop by and say, "Can you give me a quick 45-minute lesson in how to teach this play?"
Just a comment. I'm a former English teacher and supervised student teachers in English. And until fairly recently anyway, at the local schools had Shakespeare every year in high school. And the materials were very enriching, that even if you had someone who'd never had Shakespeare before, that a lot of the books that the students are going to be getting have a lot of background information. And so I think some powers that be, were trying to make it more accessible.
So study aids and things like that. Yeah. I also think films it's much easier to access films, and I think they're being used more widely in schools too.
And just as you were doing, even 10 years or more, kids were using outtakes or passages from movies to show particular scenes.
Yeah. No, technology in that sense is helping. I mean, yeah, it does. It's if they can see a film and it's a well-done film that inspires them, then they might want to see more, if not read more. Yeah.
It's within in the two different kinds. I mean, the first one is really what you might see in a theater. It's one location. It's the camera moves around.
Yeah.
And the acting is a lot more nuanced. And then you get the next one where you get a whole series of locations, inside, outside.
Right. Handheld camera in some of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's much more this modern film, almost postmodern.
Right, and the kind of cutting, increasingly when you see modern, particularly American films, they'll use the kind of cutting you get in music videos and whatnot. And young audiences respond to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We were talking about in our culture how you're questioning the future of it in education.
Yeah.
What about the other countries? Because you mentioned earlier that, like in Asia and other places, that they get exposed to it in their contemporary language.
Yeah.
Are they facing the same challenges that Shakespeare's facing?
I don't know, and I don't know whether or not the plays have been, let's say in Japan, whether when the plays are taught in schools, whether they're done in old translations, because there are many different versions of each play, because, as I said, a director can commission a modern playwright to do a new translation. So I don't know what kinds of texts they would be teaching in school. I know in Germany, they will use 18th century text because Shakespeare was regarded as the German playwright for a long time. The best criticism of Shakespeare in the 18th century was German. They were experimenting much more radically with Shakespeare in theater in the 19th century than the UK was. And so they will use translations by great 18th and 19th century poets. And so it would be relatively inaccessible for German students. They'd be reading old language. But I don't know what would be true in Asian countries or some African countries. I just don't know. Yeah.
Shakespeare is such an interesting phenomenon. When you think about characters above, in addition to individuals like Shakespeare, characters that have lasted, the duration that he's lasted, Dracula, maybe one, that other, and trying to think of others that have lasted, I think it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
As a generation, everybody in this room almost has, at some point in their life, been required to read
I don't know. It's interesting. These let me get back to the theater festivals, like the one in Oregon or the one in New Jersey. The New Jersey, almost all of these are education based, but they also have educational missions. They have big outreach programs. In the last 15 years, I believe, the New Jersey Shakespeare has taken plays into public schools and reached 500,000 students. That's a lot of high school students seeing very good productions of Shakespeare. So is that going to, and again, I'm dividing seeing it from reading it.
So the consumption may just be altered from what past experiences have been.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the future is of reading Shakespeare plays in school, but I think seeing Shakespeare is certainly not in decline. You're creating new audiences. I mean, they get government funding, et cetera, and all of that because of the educational outreach program. So there's virtually no Shakespeare company in America that doesn't have an educational outreach program. But they reach enormous numbers of students. The one in Ashland, Oregon, has educational outreach that goes as far as Los Angeles, which is 700 miles away. Yeah. They have a company of about 500. This is an enormous outfit, and about 150 of them are actors. They run 3 theaters almost all year round, 11 or 12 plays, and during the winter months, those actors do the outreach. I mean, it's big business. And by taking productions into schools, or even just doing workshops of 50 minutes, let's say, they are helping to ensure future audiences if those students have a good experience.
When you talk about translations, is what we read and what like was there, is it basically what Shakespeare wrote, only that modern spellings when we read it?
Oh yeah, I mean this is what, and in fact the first version of this scene was virtually complete. Almereyda cut a lot of the text. And in part, I think it's because he had actors who weren't as trained in verse speaking, et cetera. But yeah, that's what you would see in the page. I mean, I just edited it.
What about translations as other languages?
Yeah. There are books that you can get in English that will have Shakespeare on the right-hand page and contemporary American, let's say, on the left-hand page. Yeah. And it's not a bad way to read, provided you read both. But so there are those aids, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When did you fall in love with Shakespeare?
I hated Shakespeare in high school. I vowed I would never read another Shakespeare play. In college, I had a Shakespeare class. It wasn't required, but I decided to take it in my senior year. I didn't like the teacher at all. It was one of these classes with 150 in a lecture hall. But I was reading the plays, and I thought, oh, these aren't bad. It took me to the age of 22. And then I studied in the UK for a few years, and on my way to the university where I was going, I stopped in Stratford. And for 10 shillings, just about $1.50 then, I got a balcony ticket to the Royal Shakespeare Company and saw my first play. And I thought, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. And so I bought an old car when I was there, and I saw everything done by the Shakespeare Company for the next 3 years. It was the sort of heyday when Judi Dench was doing all of the Shakespeare heroines and Ian McKellen and others. So I knew then that's what I had to do. But if I hadn't gone to Stratford and kissed the ground, yeah, but that's when
Maybe an engineer.
Probably a lawyer. Yeah, but it took that. It took me seeing what a wonderful company could do with a play and performance. And the first play I saw was Pericles. I knew nothing about it. It was seeing it. It was seeing it. Although I thought the plays were good when I read them as a senior, but I certainly didn't think they were good before that. Yeah. There was a hand back here. Yeah.
What do you lose in translation?
If I were fluent in another language, I'd be able to tell you better. I don't know. I mean, if you have a very good...
You said you wanted, we should read both.
Oh, you're talking about contemporary American.
Yes.
you lose the glory of the verse. I mean, the Shakespeare's language is extremely complex, and if you get into it, it's gorgeous.
We get lost.
Right. But if you look at the footnotes, and sometimes you just hear the music, this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath he given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am the Thane of Cawdor. If ill, why does the hair rise on my head or whatever? I don't remember the rest of it. But it's this gorgeous, balanced syntax. I remember what I had to learn in the 9th grade. It's from The Merchant of Venice. It's Portia's speech on mercy. You know, the quality of mercy is not strained, right? The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. You know, and it's just, when I learned it, I didn't really know what I was saying, but I read it now, or I hear Judi Dench doing that speech, and it's glorious. There's no modern translation of that. Sometimes, you know, just to, for fun, if we're doing Macbeth, for example, in class, we'll be talking about Shakespeare's use of similes and metaphors. And Macbeth, when he sees blood on his hands, is appalled at the deed that he has done. And he says, what hands are here? They pluck out mine eyes. Can all the water of great Neptune's sea wash this blood from off my hand? No, rather will this my hand the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Now, all of that's metaphor. The blood on the hand clearly is a sign of his guilt, right? And what happens? Can all the waters of the sea wash the blood from his hand, purge him of his guilt? No. Rather, when he goes to wash his hand in the sea, he will dye the whole ocean red. That conveys something of the magnitude of his guilt. And it's done through that kind of poetic language, through his use of images. What would a modern translation be? He's talking to his wife. Oh, God, dear, I feel so guilty. I mean, look at my hands. I've got blood on them. I think I need to go to a shrink. You know, I mean, it's just, there's nothing you can do that would have the power and the beauty of that language. Take Shakespeare's similes and metaphors out, and you've got kind of banal language. You can understand sort of what it's saying. Or if you were translating it more literally, if I put my hand in that sea, it's going to dye the whole sea red. It's not going to do what I want it to do. Pretty pedestrian. Anybody else? Yeah.
How old was Shakespeare when he wrote his first play? What was it?
There's no certainty there, but he probably went to London in the late 1580s when he was in his mid-20s. And he probably had written his first play by about 1590, and it may have been one of his early history plays, one of the Henry VI plays, or it may have been Titus Andronicus, an early, really bloody tragedy. And if any of you want to see a film that's great fun, see Julie Taymor's Titus, with Anthony Hopkins playing Titus as a kind of Hannibal Lecter, and, who's the woman who plays Tamara? Jessica Lange, that's right. It's a wonderful film. Yeah.
I'll take down the last question. Can we, as non-students, if we're not a student in Allegheny, can we pay tuition and take your course?
You don't have to pay tuition. I'm always happy to have people just drop in.
You all heard that, so.
In fact, if there are adults who come in, I mean, do any of you know Ed Walsh? He just audited the class a couple of years ago, and it's wonderful to have adults there because they have ideas, they have life experience that they bring to the plays. You're going to say, see, kids, he read it. He understood it. Yeah, no, I'm always happy to have people drop in.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.